I still remember the exact sound my fork made when it hit the china plate. Not because I dropped it, but because my hands were shaking so hard I couldn't hold on anymore. And nobody at that table even looked up. 11 people, crystal glasses, a chandelier throwing warm gold light over a room full of people who had known each other their entire lives, a roast in the center of the table that Patricia had spent all day making and that everyone had complimented 3 times already, and me, at the far end next to Derek's aunt, who had already asked me twice what I did for work and moved on before I finished answering. That was the night I understood what it feels like to be invisible in a room full of people who can see you perfectly fine. I'm going to tell you what happened at that table, but first, I need to tell you who I was before I got there, because that part matters. That part is actually the whole story. 3 years before that dinner, I was living what most people would have called a perfectly reasonable life. I had a marketing job at a mid-sized company in Columbus. I had a 1-bedroom apartment with a window that faced a parking garage. I had a gym membership I used twice a week, a coffee order I gave on autopilot, and a life that fit inside the lines so neatly it barely made a sound. And then I met Derek. Derek Mitchell was the kind of man who walked into a room and made it feel warmer. Blonde, broad-shouldered, easy laugh. He coached his nephew's Little League team on weekends. He remembered your coffee order after the second time he saw you. My mother called him a catch, and she said it the way people say things they believe so completely they don't feel the need to explain. We moved in together after 8 months, got engaged after 14, and somewhere in that time, without either of us announcing it, my life became a wing of his. His friends became our friends. His schedule became our schedule. His apartment, the one he'd had before me, the one still arranged exactly the way he liked it, became the place I kept my things. I had this hobby that I'd carried since college, hand-lettered stationery, cards, journals, wrapping paper with little pressed flowers and ink illustrations. I used to spend Sunday mornings at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me, just drawing and writing, and it was the only part of my week that felt entirely mine. Derek tolerated it the way someone tolerates a cat they didn't ask for. He'd come into the kitchen, step around my papers, and say something like, "You really love this stuff, huh?" And I'd say yes, and he'd smile, and the conversation would end there, and I'd go back to my letters. He never yelled. That was the thing people never understood when I tried to explain it later. Derek never raised his voice. He just had this way of tilting his head and saying, "Oh, Claire." Soft, almost fond, like my whole existence was a joke only he understood the punchline to. The Sunday dinners at his parents' house started about 3 months in. Patricia Mitchell ran those dinners the way a conductor runs an orchestra. Everything in its place, every note on time, and absolute silence for any instrument that played off-key. I played off-key constantly. His brother Ryan was louder than Derek, but less subtle. His wife Melissa had the particular talent of delivering cruelty wrapped in concern. She once told me, while passing the green beans, that she admired how comfortable I seemed not caring about my career trajectory. She said it like a compliment. She meant it like a verdict. I lost my marketing job 7 months before that anniversary dinner. Company downsizing, nothing personal. I got a severance package and a LinkedIn recommendation and a Tuesday afternoon standing alone in a parking garage with a box of desk things, wondering what came next. What came next was the kitchen table. I started Threadline Paper Co. from the apartment Derek and I shared, using the severance money and 6 years of sketches I'd been keeping in a drawer. I built a website, I photographed my products on a piece of white foam board near the living room window, I researched wholesale buyers, I sent cold emails that mostly went unanswered, I worked until 2 in the morning while Derek slept, and I got up at 7 and did it again. He didn't say I should stop, he just started referring to it in front of other people as my little project, always with that same soft smile, always in a voice that made it sound affectionate. And the terrible thing, the thing I'm most ashamed of, is that I started calling it that too. The anniversary dinner was for Patricia and Gerald's 35th. Black dress, good earrings. I'd spent an hour on my hair. And that afternoon, before I even got dressed, I'd gotten an email from a boutique buyer in Columbus named Sarah Chen who wanted to place an order. 200 units of my hand-lettered journals. It was the first real wholesale order I'd ever received. I drove to that dinner glowing. I waited until the main course was cleared to mention it. I didn't make a speech. I just said, almost shyly, that I had some good news, that I'd gotten my first wholesale order that day, 200 units to a boutique in Columbus. Patricia asked, pleasantly, how much the order was worth. I told her. There was a small silence, and then Ryan laughed. Not meanly, that would have been easier to answer. He laughed the way people laugh at something that doesn't quite register as real. 200 journals, he said. That's what, like one good month for a normal business? Melissa touched his arm, which meant she agreed with him but wanted credit for restraint. Patricia set down her wine glass. She looked at me with an expression that was perfectly calibrated, not cruel, not warm, somewhere in the dry middle ground that powerful women sometimes inhabit when they want you to know they're being generous by speaking to you at all. "Claire, sweetheart," she said, "at some point you have to ask yourself whether this little project is a real business or just something to keep yourself busy while Derek does the actual work." The table moved on. Someone mentioned Ryan's promotion. Someone else asked about Patricia's sister's new house in Scottsdale. The roast was praised a fourth time. I looked at Derek. He reached for the breadbasket. It was such a small gesture, such a completely ordinary reaching for the breadbasket gesture, and it told me everything I needed to know about every single Sunday dinner I had sat through, and every single "oh, Claire," and every single night I had gone to bed convincing myself I was imagining the distance. That's when I noticed the man across the table. He was seated 3 chairs up from me, near the head of the table, silver-haired, somewhere in his late 50s, with the kind of stillness that comes from not being quiet, but from having nothing to prove. He had been introduced to me briefly at the start of the evening as a family friend, but I hadn't caught his name in the noise of everyone arriving. He was looking at me, not with pity, not with the polite blankness everyone else had arranged on their faces. He was looking at me the way someone looks at something they recognize, like he had seen this exact moment before and knew exactly what it was. The dinner continued. Ryan mentioned my craft project 2 more times, once while telling a story about a friend who'd tried to start a food truck and lost everything, and once while asking Melissa if she remembered the woman from their neighborhood who'd sold homemade candles for a year before going back to nursing. Melissa said she did remember. Derek laughed at the food truck story, and then Patricia said, to no one in particular, that she supposed everyone needed a creative outlet, and that it was sweet how some people found that in their work. My hands started shaking. The fork hit the plate. Nobody looked up, and in that moment, something inside me didn't break. I want to be clear about that, because this story is not about breaking. Something inside me simply finished deciding something it had been deciding a long time. The silver-haired man set down his napkin. He stood up from his chair. Not dramatically, not with the energy of someone making a point. He stood up with the calm of someone who has simply decided to stand. And when a person like that stands, the room notices. He looked down the table at me. "Claire Anne Whitfield," he said, my full name, like he'd been holding it all evening and finally found the right moment to place it down. "I've been watching the boutique wholesale market for about 2 years now," he said conversationally, like he was continuing a discussion that had been going on for some time. "It's actually one of the fastest growing channels in independent retail. The numbers are real. The margins are better than most people realize." He paused and looked at Patricia, not confrontationally, just directly. 3 years ago, I invested in a paper goods brand, started at a kitchen table, 2 people, a foam board, and a website. It sold 14 months later for $4.1 million. He picked up his wine glass. "The word I'd use for what Claire is building isn't little. The word I'd use is early." Then he turned to me and asked if he could see my catalog after dinner. I said yes. My voice didn't shake at all. "His name was Thomas Calloway. He had been in private equity for 30 years and had spent the last 5 doing what he called interesting small bets. He was Gerald Mitchell's college roommate. He had been in town for a conference and agreed to come to dinner as a favor. He had no reason to say any of that. None. He could have sat at that table and eaten his roast and driven back to his hotel and never thought about me again. After the other guests started moving toward the living room for dessert, Thomas and I stood in the hallway and talked for 40 minutes. He asked real questions about my production process, my pricing, my supplier relationships, my plans for scaling. He didn't talk down to me. He didn't coach me. He just listened and asked the next question. He gave me his card before he left. On the drive home, Derek was quiet for most of the way. Then, at a red light on Morse Road, he said almost gently, "You know he was probably just being polite, right?" I looked at the red light, reflecting on the wet street, and I understood with a clarity that felt less like revelation and more like a door finally swinging all the way open that I had been living inside someone else's low opinion of myself for so long I'd mistaken it for my own reflection. I didn't say anything. I watched the light turn green. I didn't leave Derek that night. I want to be honest about that. I went home and washed my face and sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time. I thought about the fork hitting the plate and nobody looking up. I thought about the breadbasket. I thought about 35 years of Sunday dinners stretching out in front of me like a road I had not chosen. Then I went to the kitchen table and emailed Thomas Calloway. The next 8 months are the part of this story I'm most proud of, and also the hardest to tell, because nothing about them was cinematic. Thomas did not swoop in and save me. He introduced me to 2 wholesale buyers over email. He spent 90 minutes on the phone with me going over my pricing model and told me very plainly that I was undercharging by about 30%. He answered my emails within a day. That was the whole of it. Everything else was mine. I redesigned my packaging line from scratch on a free graphic design platform at 1 in the morning. I lost the Columbus order because of a production delay and spent 3 days feeling like I was standing in a hole. Then I got it back, plus a second boutique in Nashville that found me through Instagram. I hired a part-time shipping assistant named Donna, who was 53 years old and faster than anyone I'd ever met. I opened a real business bank account and sat in the parking lot of the bank afterward, feeling like I'd just signed a treaty with my own future. Derek and I ended on a Sunday afternoon in March. No screaming, no dramatic scene, just a conversation that felt less like a fight and more like 2 people finally telling the truth at the same time. He told me I was making a mistake. I told him I finally wasn't. I took my boxes, and there weren't as many as I expected, which told me something too, and I drove to my new apartment, a 1-bedroom with windows that faced an actual street, and I put my foam board by the window and sat down at my kitchen table, and I got back to work. 14 months after that dinner, Threadline Paper Co. is in 34 boutiques across 11 states. Thomas invested $60,000 in exchange for a small equity stake, and when he told me why, he said it so plainly it almost made me laugh. He said, "This isn't charity. This is the most interesting thing on my desk right now." That sentence lived in me for a long time. Not the money, the word interesting. The idea that what I was building was worth taking seriously, that I was worth taking seriously. I ran into Patricia at a coffee shop about 2 months ago. She was with a friend, waiting for their order. She saw me and smiled, and we did the small talk thing, and then she mentioned as if it had just occurred to her that she'd seen Threadline Paper Co. in a boutique she'd visited on vacation in Charleston. She said it like a coincidence, like a pleasant surprise, like she had nothing to do with any of it. I smiled and said small world, and I meant the bigger truth of that, the real small world, the one in which she had absolutely nothing to do with any of it at all. I don't tell this story because a billionaire rescued me. Thomas Calloway said my name at a dinner table. He stood up and used it out loud in front of people who had spent an entire evening pretending it didn't mean anything. And that mattered. I'm not going to pretend it didn't matter. Being seen by someone who didn't have to see you is a specific kind of gift. But he said my name. I did the rest. The real thing I had to confront, the thing that was harder than losing the order, harder than leaving Derek, harder than any of the business stuff, was that I had accepted it, the label. I had heard "little project" so many times, I started putting it in my own mouth. I had sat at that table for 2 years and learned to make myself small enough to fit in the seat they assigned me. Someone calling you worthless is just noise, but the moment you stop arguing with it, that's when it stops being their story and starts becoming yours. If I could go back to that dinner table, to that woman with the shaking hands and the fork on the china plate, I wouldn't tell her to fight back. I wouldn't tell her to leave. I wouldn't give her a business plan or a pep talk or a list of things she should have said to Patricia Mitchell. I would just sit down next to her and say, "Hang on. Someone is about to say your name, and when they do, make sure you recognize it. Make sure it belongs to you, because it does. It always did." My name is Claire Anne Whitfield. I make beautiful things for a living. I built something real from a kitchen table and a foam board, and 6 years of sketches I kept in a drawer because I wasn't sure anyone would care. Someone cared, and I finally let that someone be me.